We push through the center here, bypassing the main line.
What about the flanks?
They are holding. The objective must be secured by nightfall.
The current must be considered here.
Yes, but the bridge integrity is unknown. We proceed at dawn.
Steady on the crane! Watch the cables! Right, bring her down now!
March 24th, 1945. Just after dawn. Western Germany, east of the Rhine. Low clouds hang over fields still scarred by months of artillery fire. The ground is damp. The air smells of smoke and churned soil. German soldiers look up as a distant hum grows louder. Not artillery, not tanks, but engines. Hundreds of them. Transport aircraft sweep across the sky in tight formation, their silhouettes dark against the pale morning light. Then something changes. Parachutes bloom overhead. White canopies, then larger ones. Heavier. Not men, machines. Steel shapes descend slowly, swaying beneath silk and cable. Crates slam into fields and hedgerows. Gliders crash into open farmland. And then, unmistakably, armored hulls settle onto German soil. For years, German panzer doctrine had rested on one certainty. Tanks came from roads, railheads, and assembly areas. They advanced forward. They did not fall from the sky. Yet now, armored vehicles were landing behind German lines, delivered by air, surrounded by airborne infantry already moving into position. 4 German tank crews watching from concealment. It was a moment of disbelief, a pause in the rhythm of war, because something fundamental had just broken, and what followed would challenge everything they thought they knew about armored warfare. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its final, violent phase. Germany was no longer advancing. It was reacting, patching gaps, shuffling depleted divisions, and relying increasingly on experience rather than strength. Yet despite its weakening position, the German army still possessed one decisive asset: armored doctrine refined through years of battlefield success. From Poland to France to the Eastern Front, German panzer formations had shaped the rhythm of modern warfare. Tanks were not just weapons. They were instruments of tempo. They moved fast, struck deep, and relied on coordination with infantry and artillery. Above all, they operated within a predictable logic. Armor moved along ground routes, roads, bridges, railways, supply lines, control points. This predictability shaped how German defenses were built. Behind every river line, forest belt, or fortified town stood mobile reserves. Panzer units held back, waiting to counterattack once an enemy crossing was detected. It was a system that had worked repeatedly, even as Germany's strategic position deteriorated. And nowhere was this doctrine more critical than along Germany's western frontier in early 1945. The Rhine River was the last natural barrier protecting the German heartland. Wide, cold, fast-moving. On its eastern bank, German commanders prepared for what they believed would be the decisive defensive battle of the war. They expected crossings to be hard-fought, slow, and costly. Bridges would be destroyed. Engineers would be targeted. Any bridgehead would be contained and crushed by armored counterattacks. This expectation shaped German confidence. On the Allied side, the situation looked very different. By early 1945, American, British, and Canadian forces had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, pushed through Belgium, and driven into Western Germany itself. The Ardennes counteroffensive had failed. German manpower was exhausted. Fuel was scarce. Yet Allied commanders understood something essential. Even a weakened enemy could be deadly if allowed time to react. Crossing the Rhine would not simply be another river assault. It would be an announcement that the war had entered its final act. But the Rhine presented a familiar Allied problem. River crossings forced attackers to slow down. They required engineers, bridging equipment, and carefully staged assaults. That pause, sometimes measured in hours, sometimes days, was exactly what German panzer reserves needed to mobilize. The Allies had learned this lesson before. In Italy, in Normandy, and during Operation Market Garden, airborne troops had been used to seize key terrain ahead of advancing ground forces. Bridges, road junctions, high ground. But airborne units suffered from a recurring weakness. They landed light. They were mobile only on foot. And once the initial surprise faded, they were vulnerable to German armor. At Arnhem, British paratroopers had faced German tanks with little more than anti-tank guns and bravery. The result was catastrophic. German armor had arrived faster than expected, and once it did, lightly armed airborne units were gradually crushed. That failure haunted Allied planners. Airborne forces were invaluable. They disrupted defenses. They caused confusion. They seized objectives no ground force could reach in time. But without armor, they remained fragile. They could not exploit breakthroughs. They could not withstand sustained counterattacks. The question became unavoidable. If airborne troops could be dropped behind enemy lines, why not drop armor with them? This was not a new idea. Both Germany and the Allies had experimented with air-landing light vehicles early in the war. But tanks presented a different challenge entirely. Weight, size, fragility during landing. Even the strongest transport aircraft had limits. German planners had largely dismissed the concept. Their airborne doctrine emphasized infantry and light guns. Tanks, they believed, belonged to the ground battle. The risks were too high, the returns uncertain. American planners, facing a different strategic problem, reached a different conclusion. They did not need heavy tanks in the air. They needed just enough armor, mobile, protected firepower to tip the balance during the most vulnerable hours after an airborne landing. By late 1944, this idea was no longer theoretical. Designs had been tested, aircraft had been modified, crews had been trained, and a small, lightly armored tank, built specifically for the sky, was waiting for its moment. As Allied armies closed in on the Rhine, the final proving ground for airborne armor was taking shape. And German tank crews, watching the skies in March 1945, had no idea such a weapon even existed. The idea of airborne armor forced engineers and commanders to confront a simple, brutal reality. A tank light enough to fly would never match the protection or firepower of one built for the ground. Every kilogram mattered. Armor thickness, gun size, fuel capacity, crew comfort. All of it had to be sacrificed for one overriding requirement: weight. For the United States, this challenge fell to a nation already accustomed to industrial experimentation. American industry did not ask whether something had been done before. It asked whether it could be done fast enough to matter. By 1941, U.S. airborne doctrine was still forming. Paratroopers were new. Glider troops were experimental. The early focus was on men and light equipment. But as airborne exercises grew larger and more complex, one weakness became impossible to ignore. Once on the ground, paratroopers lacked the means to deal with armored threats without calling for help they might not receive in time. Light anti-tank guns could be dropped by glider. Bazookas could be carried by infantry. But these were defensive answers. They could stop a tank. They could not replace one. The British confronted the same problem. Their solution was bold. They developed the Hamilcar glider, a massive aircraft capable of carrying a light tank into combat. By 1944, British airborne units had already landed Tetrarch tanks during operations in Normandy. The concept worked, but it was limited. Gliders were vulnerable. Landing zones had to be clear. Losses were heavy. The Americans observed carefully. Rather than rely solely on gliders, U.S. planners explored the idea of parachute delivery, dropping armored vehicles directly from transport aircraft. This would allow tanks to land closer to paratroopers over a wider area and with greater flexibility. It was a radical approach, and it required a radical vehicle. The result was the M22 Locust. Designed in 1943, the Locust was never meant to fight enemy tanks head-on. It was conceived as airborne fire support, a way to give paratroopers mobility, protection from small arms fire, and a weapon capable of suppressing enemy positions. At just over 7 tons, it was dramatically lighter than a Sherman. Its armor was thin. Its crew of 3 worked in cramped conditions. Its main gun, a 37 millimeters, was already considered underpowered by 1945 standards. But the Locust had one crucial advantage. It could fly. The tank was small enough to be carried under transport aircraft or loaded into heavy gliders. Its design prioritized balance and compactness. Turret height was minimized. Hull length was reduced. Every line reflected compromise. Training crews for such a vehicle required a different mindset. Tankers were taught to think like paratroopers, isolated, surrounded, operating without guaranteed resupply. Airborne infantry were trained to think like mechanized troops, using armor to punch through resistance, not merely survive it. By late 1944, American airborne divisions began incorporating armored elements into their planning. It was not universally welcomed. Some commanders questioned the value of light tanks in a battlefield increasingly dominated by heavier armor. Others worried that the logistical complexity outweighed the benefits. Yet the strategic situation left little room for caution. The Rhine had to be crossed. German reserves had to be disoriented. Any delay would cost lives. Operation Market Garden had shown the danger of underestimating German reaction speed. This time, Allied planners were determined to overwhelm the enemy's ability to respond, not just with numbers but with shock. The plan that emerged was Operation Varsity. Unlike earlier airborne operations, Varsity would be conducted in daylight, with overwhelming air superiority and in direct coordination with ground forces crossing the Rhine. It would involve more aircraft than any previous single-day airborne drop. And for the first time in American combat history, tanks would descend from the sky alongside paratroopers. German intelligence had detected increased Allied air activity. They expected airborne landings. They prepared for infantry. They positioned flak guns. They readied panzer units to counterattack once the drops were identified. What they did not prepare for was armor already on the ground when the counterattack began. By March 1945, the stage was set. The sky would deliver what German doctrine said was impossible. And the moment those parachutes opened, the assumptions of an entire armor tradition would be tested. For the airborne soldiers who trained with the M22 Locust, the tank was more than steel and rivets. It was reassurance, a moving shield, a promise that, this time, they would not be alone when German armor arrived. Airborne units were accustomed to isolation. They dropped at night. They landed scattered. They fought with what they carried. The presence of even a light tank changed how they thought about the battlefield. With armor beside them, paratroopers could push forward instead of digging in. They could clear roadblocks instead of bypassing them. They could hold open terrain long enough for relief to arrive. For the tank crews, the experience was even more disorienting. Traditional tank warfare began on roads or in assembly areas. Crews mounted their vehicles, checked radios, warmed engines, and advanced in formation. Airborne tankers began their day inside an aircraft, engines silent, hulls chained down, surrounded by the sound of propellers and flak bursts. They did not drive into battle. They fell into it. The drop itself was a moment of total vulnerability. Parachutes could fail. Harnesses could twist. Wind could drag a 7-ton vehicle sideways into trees or buildings. Crews had no control until impact, and impact was never gentle. Once on the ground, the risks continued. Tanks landed without infantry screens. Radios could be damaged. Ammunition could scatter. Recovery took time that airborne units rarely had. From a technological standpoint, the Locust represented a gamble. Its armor could not stop German anti-tank guns. Its gun could not penetrate most German tanks from the front. Against a Panther or a Panzer IV at range, it was outmatched. But technology does not exist in isolation. It exists in context. The Locust was not designed to fight German tanks head-on. It was designed to appear where German tanks did not expect resistance at all. Its value lay in shock, speed, and presence. Even light armor forced the enemy to react differently. Infantry hesitated. Machine gun nests fell silent. Anti-tank teams had to reveal themselves. And perhaps most importantly, the Locust altered German assumptions. German intelligence officers had long believed that Allied airborne forces were lightly armed. Dangerous, yes, but temporary. Once contained, they could be destroyed by coordinated counterattacks. That belief shaped response times. It shaped confidence. When German units encountered armored vehicles where none were expected, that confidence eroded. Orders slowed. Reports contradicted doctrine. Commanders hesitated, unsure whether they faced isolated vehicles or a larger mechanized force. This psychological effect mattered. In war, surprise is not just about weapons. It is about breaking the enemy's mental model of the battlefield. The appearance of tanks delivered by air did exactly that. For airborne infantry advancing behind those light tanks, the effect was immediate. German resistance was often disorganized. Strongpoints fell faster. Road junctions were secured with fewer casualties. Not because the Locust was powerful, but because it should not have been there at all. And as German panzer units began to move toward the landing zones, they did so with incomplete information, reacting to something their doctrine had never prepared them to face. That tension between expectation and reality was about to be tested in combat. From a tactical standpoint, the arrival of airborne armor changed the rhythm of the battlefield in subtle but decisive ways. German defensive plans relied on time. Time to identify a landing zone. Time to isolate it. Time to assemble mobile reserves. Lightly armed airborne troops could be delayed, pinned, and destroyed if counterattacks arrived quickly enough. Airborne tanks disrupted that timetable. Even a handful of light armored vehicles could seize road junctions faster than infantry alone. They could push through small unit resistance without stopping to reorganize. They could suppress German strong points long enough for paratroopers to maneuver. The battlefield moved faster, and speed was the one resource German commanders no longer had. For German panzer crews, the encounter was deeply unsettling. Tank warfare was built on recognition, identifying enemy silhouettes, judging engagement distances, and choosing favorable ground. Airborne armor broke that pattern. Tanks appeared in unexpected locations, fields, forest edges, villages still assumed to be behind friendly lines. German tank units advancing toward reported airborne landings often expected to face infantry. Instead, they encountered armored vehicles already in motion. This forced immediate decisions under pressure. Engage with tanks unsuited for close combat, withdraw and reassess, call for infantry support that might not be available. Leadership on both sides mattered enormously. Allied commanders understood the limitations of airborne armor. They did not expect the Locust to win tank battles. They expected it to hold space, just long enough. Orders emphasized aggression, mobility, and coordination with infantry. Crews were instructed to avoid prolonged engagements and to use terrain creatively, appearing, firing, and relocating before heavier enemy units could respond. German leadership faced a different problem. Reports arriving at headquarters were confusing. Some described tanks. Others denied it. Some units reported heavy armor. Others insisted it was only light vehicles. In the chaos of a massive airborne assault, clarity was rare. This confusion slowed decision-making. Enemy angle mattered as well. German infantry, already strained by constant retreat and air attacks, reacted differently when faced with armor instead of paratroopers alone. Anti-tank weapons were not always positioned forward. Morale faltered when assumptions collapsed. There was also a moral dimension to this innovation. Airborne armor increased the intensity of fighting immediately after landing. German units had less opportunity to disengage or surrender before being overrun. For airborne troops, the presence of tanks reduced casualties, but it also accelerated the pace of combat. This was warfare compressed into hours instead of days. Operation Varsity was designed to overwhelm German defenses in a single, coordinated blow. Airborne infantry, gliders, paratroopers, and now, tanks from the sky. Each element amplified the others. None could succeed alone. Together, they created a form of shock that German doctrine had never anticipated. As March 24th, 1945 approached, Allied aircraft lined up on runways across England. Crews memorized drop zones. Tank crews checked harnesses and shackles one last time. Infantry prepared to land under fire. Across the Rhine, German units waited, certain they knew what was coming. They did not, because when the first aircraft crossed the river that morning, theory ended, and the war entered its decisive moment. March 24th, 1945. 9:45 hours. The Rhine lay below in long, gray bands, reflecting a sky crowded with aircraft. From horizon to horizon, transport planes advanced in layered formations. C-47s, C-40SXS, gliders in tow, engines roaring at full power. Allied air superiority was absolute. German fighters were almost entirely absent. Anti-aircraft fire rose anyway, black bursts tearing holes in the air. Operation Varsity had begun. Unlike earlier airborne assaults, this one unfolded in broad daylight. The Allies wanted visibility, precision, speed. Thousands of paratroopers from the U.S. 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne descended east of the Rhine, landing almost simultaneously across multiple drop zones. The scale was overwhelming. Within minutes, German defenders realized this was not a raid. It was an invasion from the sky. Parachutes opened in dense clusters. Men hit the ground running, weapons already firing. Gliders slammed into fields, hedgerows, and roads, splintering apart under fire. Casualties were heavy, but momentum was relentless. Then came the machines. M22 Locust tanks, secured beneath transport aircraft or delivered by heavy gliders, began their descent. Some landed hard. Some skidded across open ground. A few were damaged on impact, but many survived intact. Crews scrambled out, cut away parachutes, cleared debris from tracks, and brought engines to life. Within minutes of landing, tanks were moving. 4 German units observing from concealed positions. The sight was shocking. Reports flooded local headquarters. Enemy tanks already active inside the drop zones. At first, some commanders dismissed the claims as confusion. Others suspected misidentification. Airborne tanks contradicted everything German doctrine taught. Yet the evidence was unmistakable. Light armor rolled through villages still assumed secure. Machine gun positions were suppressed. Infantry strongpoints were overrun before they could reorganize. Airborne troops, supported by armor, advanced faster than expected, far faster. German panzer units began to move toward the landing areas. Orders were issued to counterattack immediately, but coordination was difficult. Roads were clogged with retreating units and refugees. Allied aircraft strafed anything that moved. Communication lines were damaged or destroyed. As German tanks advanced, they encountered resistance where none should have existed. Not entrenched infantry, not scattered paratroopers, but armored vehicles already holding ground. The first clashes were brief and chaotic. Locust crews avoided direct confrontations, using cover and mobility to delay heavier enemy tanks. They fired, withdrew, repositioned. Their purpose was not victory, but disruption. And disruption was exactly what they achieved. German counterattacks slowed. Units hesitated, unsure of the enemy's strength. Precious time slipped away, minutes that turned into hours. Hours that allowed Allied ground forces west of the Rhine to expand their bridgeheads. By midday, it was clear the operation had succeeded in its primary objective. German defenses were fragmented, their response disjointed. The window for an effective armored counterstroke was closing, but the fighting was not over. As German panzer units finally closed in, airborne armor faced its most dangerous test: direct contact with a force it was never designed to fight. And in those moments, decisions made under fire would shape the final outcome. By early afternoon, the initial chaos of the airborne landings began to give way to hard contact. German panzer units, operating in fragmented groups, pushed toward the drop zones from multiple directions. These were not the massed armored formations of earlier years. Fuel shortages, losses, and Allied air attacks had reduced them to smaller, improvised battle groups. But they were still dangerous. For M22 Locust crews, this was the moment they had trained to avoid and the moment they could not escape. German tanks appeared at forest edges, along roads, and at village entrances. Panzer IVs, assault guns, armored vehicles far heavier and more powerful than anything the airborne tanks could confront directly. Engagement distances were short. Visibility was limited. Smoke hung in the air from burning gliders and damaged vehicles. Locust crews did not seek decisive engagements. They used terrain ruthlessly. Hedgerows, buildings, shallow depressions in the ground. They fired quickly, targeting infantry, soft vehicles, and gun positions rather than tanks. When German armor responded, they moved. Every minute they survived mattered. German tank commanders faced an unexpected problem. They were being delayed, not by strength, but by uncertainty. They could not simply overrun the landing zones. Resistance appeared mobile and coordinated. The presence of armor suggested a larger, mechanized force might follow. Caution replaced aggression. This hesitation proved costly. Allied airborne infantry consolidated their positions. Anti-tank guns were brought forward. Bazooka teams took up concealed positions. Artillery spotting improved as communication stabilized. The battlefield began to solidify in favor of the attackers. In several instances, German tanks withdrew after brief engagements, choosing to reposition rather than risk ambush. This bought more time that Allied ground forces crossing the Rhine used to push eastward and link up with airborne units. The psychological impact was unmistakable. Captured German reports later described confusion over the scale of Allied airborne capabilities. Some units believed they faced a full armored brigade. Others assumed heavy tanks would soon arrive by air. In reality, the airborne armor element was small, but perception mattered more than numbers. By late afternoon, the decisive moment had passed. German counterattacks lost momentum. Communications broke down further under constant air attack. The opportunity to crush the airborne bridgehead before ground forces arrived was gone. For the Locust tanks, losses were real. Several were destroyed by anti-tank fire. Others were abandoned due to mechanical damage sustained during landing. But their mission was never survival. It was disruption. And in that role, they succeeded. By nightfall, Allied ground units had crossed the Rhine in force. The airborne bridgehead held. German defenses east of the river began to collapse in sequence. The Rhine, once considered Germany's final defensive line, had been breached not only by engineers and infantry, but by tanks delivered from the sky. The shock of that moment rippled outward, shaping the final weeks of the war. And as the guns fell silent across the drop zones, the full consequences of that innovation began to emerge. When the fighting east of the Rhine finally settled into a grim quiet, the ground told the story before the reports did. Burned gliders lay scattered across fields. Parachutes tangled in trees and power lines. Craters marked where anti-aircraft fire had found its targets. And among them, light tanks, some still mobile, others destroyed, sat in places no armored vehicle had ever belonged. Operation Varsity was, by every measurable standard, a success. Within a single day, Allied airborne forces had secured key terrain east of the Rhine. German defensive lines were fractured. Counterattacks failed to regain lost ground. Most critically, Allied ground forces crossed the river and linked up with airborne units far faster than German planners had anticipated. Casualties were heavy, especially among airborne troops exposed during daylight drops. The U.S. 17th Airborne Division suffered significant losses in its initial landings. British airborne units faced similar challenges. But German casualties were severe as well, compounded by confusion, delayed reactions, and constant air attack. The role of airborne armor was carefully analyzed in post-operation reports. The M22 Locust had not dominated the battlefield. It had not destroyed German panzer formations. In purely technical terms, it remained underarmed and lightly protected. But that was never its purpose. What it provided was tempo. After-action reports noted that airborne units, supported by light armor, advanced more rapidly, secured objectives faster, and held ground more effectively during the critical hours before relief arrived. German counterattacks encountered resistance earlier than expected and often halted to reassess. German documents captured after the operation reflected this uncertainty. Reports referenced unexpected armored resistance within airborne zones. Some commanders overestimated the scale of Allied armored presence, assuming follow-on drops would reinforce the initial landings. That miscalculation mattered. German panzer units that might have counterattacked immediately instead paused, regrouped, or sought confirmation. In a battle decided by hours, that hesitation proved decisive. From an Allied perspective, the psychological effect of airborne armor exceeded its physical impact. The presence of tanks, even light ones, changed how German units perceived the threat. It disrupted established response patterns and forced defensive decisions under incomplete information. Not all assessments were positive. Several Locust tanks were lost during landing. Mechanical reliability was a concern. The difficulty of coordinating airborne armor with infantry under combat conditions was noted. Some commanders questioned whether the resources required justified the results. Yet even critics acknowledged a central truth. The concept had worked. For the first and only time in the European theater, American tanks had been delivered by air directly into combat. They had fulfilled their mission, and they had done so at the exact moment when speed mattered most. As Allied armies surged eastward into Germany, the significance of that moment extended beyond the Rhine. It marked the point at which German defensive doctrine, carefully constructed over years, had finally been overwhelmed from every direction at once. In the weeks following Operation Varsity, Allied forces advanced rapidly across Western Germany. Resistance continued, but it lacked cohesion. German units retreated, surrendered, or disintegrated under constant pressure. The Rhine crossing had opened the door, and there would be no second defensive line of comparable strength. As the war moved toward its conclusion, assessments of airborne armor became more measured. The M22 Locust was not adopted as a long-term solution. Its limitations were undeniable. Thin armor made it vulnerable. Its guns struggled against even medium German tanks. Maintenance in forward areas proved difficult, and the risks of airborne delivery remained high, even under ideal conditions. Post-war doctrine reflected these realities. Airborne forces would continue to rely primarily on infantry, artillery, and later, helicopters for mobility and fire support. Tanks would remain ground-based instruments, supported by improved air power rather than delivered by it. Yet to judge airborne armor solely by what it did not become would miss its historical significance. The Locust represented a moment when necessity pushed innovation to its edge. Faced with a problem that demanded speed above all else, Allied planners accepted imperfection in exchange for shock. They understood that winning did not always require superiority in firepower. Sometimes it required breaking the enemy's expectations. German panzer doctrine had evolved in a world where armor moved along predictable paths. Operation Varsity shattered that assumption. It demonstrated that control of the sky could reshape the ground battle in ways previously unthinkable. Captured German officers later remarked on the disorientation caused by the scale and coordination of the airborne assault. While tanks from the sky were only one part of that experience, they became a symbol of how completely the battlefield had changed. For the soldiers who fought there, the memory was more personal. Airborne infantry remembered the sound of engines starting where none should have existed. Tank crews remembered the moment their tracks touched German soil after a fall through open air. German defenders remembered looking through binoculars and seeing armored silhouettes where maps said there should be none. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. The Locust faded into history. The doctrine it represented was not repeated on the same scale. But the lesson endured. War rewards those willing to challenge assumptions, especially when time is the enemy. And sometimes, victory arrives not with overwhelming force, but with a moment of disbelief that freezes the defender just long enough. History often measures victory in numbers. Tanks destroyed, bridges crossed, lives lost or saved. Yet some moments leave a mark not in statistics, but in the shock they deliver. The instant when expectation is broken and reality refuses to comply with doctrine. The airborne tanks of March 1945 were precisely such a moment. They were light, fragile, and almost absurd in their conception. Yet their presence disrupted, delayed, and disoriented. They forced decisions under uncertainty. They demonstrated the extraordinary power of perception in war. Innovation in combat is rarely perfect. The M22 Locust was not a perfect tank, nor was airborne armor a perfect tactic. It was a compromise, a gamble, a response to circumstances where conventional solutions would have failed. But war rewards boldness. It rewards the commanders who see beyond established norms and the crews willing to place themselves in unprecedented danger. In the fields east of the Rhine, a new kind of psychological weapon was born. Not an explosive firepower, but in the sudden, undeniable impossibility of what the enemy was witnessing. The story of airborne tanks is a story of human ingenuity confronting the constraints of physics, machinery, and fear. It reminds us that history is shaped as much by ideas as by force. By dropping tanks from the sky, Allied planners challenged not only German armor doctrine, but also the assumptions of warfare itself. For a few hours over the Rhine, the impossible became reality, and the battlefield, and those who fought upon it, would never be the same again. And in that transformation, one lesson endures. Sometimes victory depends less on the size of your weapons than on the audacity to defy expectation.